Hey there, sleepy traveler. Tonight we're lighting a candle, opening a dusty scroll, and diving headfirst into the tangled bedsheets and betrothal documents of medieval Europe. That's right. Tonight's story is about love, the kind that involved your father negotiating livestock prices with your future in-laws while you pretended not to exist. But before we wander into this romantic fog of courtly gestures and deeply impractical poetry, go ahead and make yourself comfortable. Dim the lights, maybe turn on a little background hum, something soft like a fan or the faint sound of heartbreak. If you enjoy these bedtime history stories, give this one a like and subscribe, but only if you truly mean it. After all, love and algorithms should be genuine. And of course, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. I always love hearing who's joining me from across time zones and centuries. You never know. Someone out there might just be your soulmate. Assuming your soulmate is also obsessed with medieval bedbugs and romantic feasts involving boiled cabbage. Now, let's take a breath. Let go of the day's stress. Whether your heart is full, lonely, or just slightly confused, this is your time to drift into a calmer headspace. And maybe learn a few things about how complicated love was before texting, ghosting, and "it's not you, it's me." Because if you think dating is weird now, oh, dear listener, medieval dating would like a word. And a chaperone. Back then, love wasn't usually a matter of swiping right. It was more often a matter of land rights, family alliances, church doctrine, and the occasional symbolic gesture involving a dead bird. Romantic, right? You might imagine two people locking eyes across a candlelit feast. Maybe a knight in shining armor rescuing a maiden from a tower, or a lady dropping a silk handkerchief and the man picking it up with a flourish that says, "My lady, I would fight 12 men and a wild boar for you." And sometimes that actually did happen. Just as often, medieval romance looked like this. You'll marry your cousin's neighbor's daughter because she comes with a cow, a healthy goat, and a small plot of turnip-infested land. Do not argue. The cow is non-negotiable. Love and marriage were more practical than poetic for most people. And yet, somehow, humans found ways to flirt, to pine, to write the medieval equivalent of breakup letters. Some even eloped, committed minor crimes, or faked their own deaths just to avoid marriage. Because even in a world with chamber pots and plague, dating was still a glorious mess. For the next hour or so, we'll explore the odd, often hilarious, occasionally heartbreaking world of medieval relationships. We'll meet nobles who thought poetry was foreplay, peasants who made do with what they had, monks who weren't quite as celibate as advertised, and plenty of people who found love despite every possible obstacle, including social class, bad hygiene, and the crushing weight of their parents' expectations. Each story is a self-contained little chapter, something you can drift off to, return to, or listen straight through as you wind down. There's no need to keep track. Just let yourself be carried by the rhythm of history and the warm, strange pulse of ancient hearts. So snuggle in. Maybe imagine yourself in a candlelit hall with long wooden tables and the distant sound of a lute being badly played. You're wearing something itchy but expensive looking. The fire crackles. A stranger catches your eye across the room, or maybe it's just the goat again. Hard to say in this lighting. Welcome to medieval dating. Let's start at the beginning, or rather, the meeting. That moment in any great love story where two souls collide across a crowded room, or in medieval Europe where two families reluctantly shake hands in front of a notary while their children hide behind the livestock. Because here's the first thing to understand about dating in the Middle Ages. It wasn't really a thing. You didn't date. You didn't flirt with a stranger at a tavern while sipping something mysterious. You didn't ask anyone if they wanted to grab a drink sometime. You were lucky if you got to speak to the person you were marrying before you were already legally attached, spiritually bound, and financially evaluated for your oat production potential. For most people, Marriage was a contract, and like most contracts, it was negotiated, signed, sealed, and ideally witnessed by at least one grumpy uncle and a village priest. Romantic love, as we understand it today, was a delightful, optional extra. Think of it like medieval ketchup. Nice if you had it, but not at all expected, and sometimes made from turnips. So how did people meet? Well, mostly they didn't. Not freely, anyway. For peasants, the dating pool was limited to your village, which was usually about the size of a modern grocery store parking lot. You knew everyone. Everyone knew you. There was no mystery, no getting to know someone. You already knew them. You knew who snored, who cheated at dice, and who had a tendency to talk to their chickens a little too intimately. In fact, many medieval couples grew up together. They played as children, worked in the same fields, attended the same festivals, and then one day, their parents announced they were getting married. Surprise! It's a wedding, and the pig is already roasting. Occasionally, something more spontaneous would occur. A wandering tradesman might arrive in town with stories, strange spices, and a questionable haircut. A visiting relative could turn heads, especially if they had all their teeth. But for the most part, your dating prospects were local, known, and pre-approved by your mother. Now, if you were a noble, things were even less romantic. Your marriage wasn't just about land, it was land. Royal and noble families treated marriage as a geopolitical chess move. It was all about alliances, military support, and making sure no one ended up with a castle too close to the enemy. A typical noble proposal might go like this. My lord, may I suggest we marry your daughter to Count Raymond's youngest son? He is only mildly disfigured and comes with 3 vineyards and 1 functioning moat. Excellent. Send a falcon with the paperwork. Love? Feelings? Chemistry? Those were things you worked out after the contract was signed. Maybe? If you were lucky. And if not? Well, there was always falconry. Of course, festivals were one of the few times the usual rules bent slightly. Local fairs, religious holidays, harvest dances. These were prime opportunities for young people to mix, flirt, and make bad decisions behind hay bales. There are medieval records of men being fined for excessive wooing during church events, which, if nothing else, proves that the ancient art of making a fool of yourself in front of someone cute is timeless. Monasteries and nunneries, meanwhile, were supposed to be romance-free zones. Emphasis on supposed to be. We'll get to that in a later chapter. In short, meeting someone wasn't a matter of chemistry. It was a matter of logistics. A well-timed visit. A marriage broker. A cousin with strong opinions. A chance encounter on a pilgrimage where both parties were trying not to look too sweaty. Love was less about fate and more about availability. And livestock. Always livestock. But somehow, against all odds, people did fall in love. They made eye contact across church pews. They exchanged tokens, a ribbon, a ring, a surprisingly fragrant apple. They whispered, in Latin or in broken French, that they hoped to see each other again at the next feast. And maybe they did. Because no matter how rigid the rules, no matter how many parents were involved, the human heart has always had a flair for the dramatic. Even in a world without first dates, sometimes the spark still found a way. Imagine trying to impress someone without speaking to them privately, touching them, or so much as catching them alone without a third party present. Sounds like the world's most frustrating romantic escape room, doesn't it? Welcome to medieval courtship. This was a time when just looking at someone for a bit too long could raise eyebrows, provoke scandal, or earn you a lecture from a local priest about guarding your gaze. Courtship in the Middle Ages wasn't so much about flirting as it was about performance. Highly stylized, endlessly coded, and occasionally accompanied by a lute. Physical affection? Off the table. Publicly, at least. You might be able to sneak a glance, pass a note, or accidentally on purpose touch hands while reaching for the same goblet. But even that was risky. Modesty wasn't just encouraged, it was enforced, with rules, surveillance, and the kind of disapproving expressions perfected by elderly relatives and monastic elders everywhere. For the nobility especially, courting was a public affair. Literally. It was often conducted in court, the royal court, that is, under the careful eyes of the entire aristocratic peanut gallery. Every word, every look, every awkward curtsy was scrutinized for intent. Gossip thrived on this stuff. It was the medieval version of a dating show, except with more embroidery and fewer roses. A gentleman didn't express affection with a kiss or a hug. He composed a ballad. He sent symbolic gifts, an embroidered sleeve, a carved token, or perhaps a falcon, wearing a tiny decorative hood. If he was truly daring, he might inscribe his beloved's name on his shield and go jousting. Because nothing says, "I like you," like hurling yourself at another man on horseback while wearing full-body armor. Meanwhile, the lady in question had to balance between showing interest and maintaining perfect decorum. Smile too much? Forward. Look away entirely? Cold. The goal was to be alluring and unattainable at the same time, like a cat wearing a chastity belt. Among the middle and lower classes, things were only slightly less theatrical. A young man might leave small gifts outside a woman's home, flowers, food, or a really clean turnip if times were tough. He might sing outside her window, not because he was especially musical, but because the absence of texting left limited options for nighttime wooing. Conversation, if allowed, took place in the presence of others. A walk together? Sure, but with a chaperone. A conversation by the fire? Fine, as long as the fire was in a very public room, preferably with a grandmother knitting ominously in the corner. Sometimes, young lovers developed their own codes. A lace tucked into a sleeve could mean, "I'm interested." A sprig of rosemary might signal affection. In some regions, a girl would give a man a shirt she had sewn herself, an act that bordered on scandalous intimacy, given the implications. "You wear this on your body, sir." Of course, the most poetic and frustrating form of love in the Middle Ages was courtly love. This was the idealized, platonic, often unconsummated passion that poets and troubadours adored. It was all about yearning. Endless, dramatic, impractical yearning. A knight pledging eternal devotion to a lady he could never touch, usually because she was married to someone else. The entire genre is basically one long medieval playlist titled Songs to Yearn To. These relationships existed more in the imagination than in reality, and that was the point. The distance, the impossibility, the complete lack of physical fulfillment, that was where the drama lived. Because nothing fires up human desire quite like rules, consequences, and impossible expectations. So, to court in the Middle Ages was to be patient, to perform, to signal, to suffer romantically, often in verse, and above all, to never, ever be alone in a room together. Unless you wanted to end up in church court explaining why your spiritual admiration resulted in a baby 9 months later. Still, sometimes, through all the constraints and complications people connected, a glance turned into a whisper into a smile, and a smile into a secret that lasted a lifetime, or at least until someone's goat gave it away. Let's say you've spotted your romantic target across the mead hall. You've exchanged the legally mandated number of supervised glances. Maybe you've even spoken a few words in each other's general direction while pretending to discuss the weather or sheep. What next? You can't exactly slide into their DMs. You can't even pass them a note without a chaperone squinting at it and saying, looks like temptation in cursive. So how did medieval people whisper sweet nothings across vast distances of social restriction? Answer: through objects. Specifically, love tokens, letters, symbols, and embroidery, because nothing says passion like spending 7 weeks sewing someone's initials onto a strip of linen and hoping it doesn't get misinterpreted as a laundry label. Let's start with the classic, the love letter. In a world without emojis, medieval love letters were intense, flowery, formal, and often slightly desperate. If you think modern texting is exhausting, imagine trying to write a heartfelt plea for affection using only quill, ink, and an understanding of 14th century French metaphors. And yes, many of these letters survive. Some were dictated to scribes because the sender was illiterate, which makes for a wonderfully awkward image. A knight in armor, pacing dramatically while a bored scribe writes, "To my most luminous lady, whose beauty doth outshine the harvest moon." These letters weren't casual, they were serious business. Love was compared to illness, to fire, to battle wounds, to religious ecstasy. A typical letter might include lines like, "My soul is captive to your mercy, my heart weeps for your gaze, and my entrails are aflame with the fever of longing," which is either romantic or a warning that someone's about to faint in public. But let's say you didn't have the literacy, the means, or the nerve to send a letter. You could try heraldry, the medieval version of Instagram stories. Knights often wore badges, crests, or symbols on their shields that announced not just their lineage but their affections. If a knight dedicated himself to a lady, he might wear her colors in a tournament or embroider her initials onto his banner. This was more than romantic. It was dangerous. Publicly pledging yourself to someone, especially a noblewoman, could offend her family, complicate inheritance, or cause actual wars. But the bolder the gesture, the deeper the sighs from the gallery. Then, there were handkerchiefs, ribbons or sleeves, literal pieces of a woman's clothing given to a man as a token. Picture a knight tying his beloved silk scarf around his arm before charging into battle. The practical effect? None. The symbolic impact? Huge. This gift exchange wasn't always one-sided. Men sometimes gave women rings, carved brooches, or poetry written on small strips of parchment. Jewelry was common too, if ye had the money for it. A ring with a small stone, a clasp for a cloak, or even a piece of glass polished to look like a gem could serve as a romantic offering. For the truly creative, there were coded messages. Some couples developed entire systems of secret symbols, flowers pressed into letters, knots tied a certain way, even the positioning of embroidery stitches. It was love via cryptography, and since privacy was rare, anything you wanted to say had to be sayable in code or said aloud through a lute-playing third party, which is as awkward as it sounds. Troubadours, by the way, were the medieval equivalents of radio dedications. Nobles often hired them to write and perform songs dedicated to a beloved, complete with dramatic sighs and minor key melodies. If you've ever had someone make you a mixtape, you get the idea. Except in this case, the playlist was a guy with a bad haircut and a harp. Some tokens were even more unusual. A comb, a book, a miniature religious relic. Nothing says "I adore you" like half of a saint's elbow bone. In rare cases, especially among royalty, entire buildings were dedicated as romantic gestures. "I built you this castle. Please overlook the moat." It's metaphorical, so if someone ever gives you a gift that seems oddly specific, like a hand-stitched linen square with a falcon on it and 3 red roses, it might not be random. It might be love. Or they might just be medieval. In the world of coded glances and eternal yearning, these small tokens were lifelines. Proof that love existed. Even if it had to be wrapped in metaphor, sealed with wax, and delivered by a very nervous messenger who swore he wasn't involved. Imagine this. You're in love. You've sent a ribbon, received a vaguely poetic love letter in return, and even managed a supervised stroll under the eyes of 3 ants and 1 suspicious chicken. It's all going well. There's only one tiny, unavoidable hurdle left before you can get married. Money. Property. Goats. Welcome to the world of the dowry. Medieval romance's least sexy but most essential component. It's the part of love no troubadour sings about, and no bard wants to put to lute music. Because while your heart might say yes, your family might say, What's her land yield per acre? A dowry, in its simplest form, was the wealth a bride's family gave to the groom or his household at the time of marriage. This could include money, land, livestock, furniture, linens, tools, jewelry, or, in one particularly bizarre case, a really nice barrel. The point was simple. Marriage was a contract, and every contract came with terms. Now, this wasn't some random tradition. It was a necessity. In a world where women had few legal rights and marriage often meant moving into a husband's home, the dowry was a way to ensure she didn't arrive empty-handed. It was her buy-in, her entry fee, her "I come bearing turnips and a side table" moment, and it could make or break a match. Let's say you're a moderately attractive peasant lad named John. You've got strong teeth, rare, a decent hut, and you only smell like garlic most of the time. You fancy Margaret, the miller's daughter. She's witty, has a strong chin, and once rescued a pig from a ditch using only her apron. A catch. But Margaret doesn't come with much. Maybe a chicken. A very moody goat. A blanket that smells like history. Your parents, practical folk that they are, might gently steer you toward Agnes, whose family owns 2 cows and 3 extra acres. Never mind that Agnes thinks laughter is a sin and considers eye contact scandalous. Her dowry has potential. And this wasn't just peasant drama. Among the nobility, dowries were political weapons. Entire alliances were formed based on what a bride brought with her. When Eleanor of Aquitaine married Henry II of England, she didn't just bring herself. She brought vast lands, wealth, and enough political leverage to cause 4 decades of family feuds and bar fights disguised as wars. The size of a dowry could also influence how a woman was treated. A rich dowry meant protection, status, and sometimes even a bit of freedom. A poor dowry? That could lead to a life of servitude in her own home, or worse, marriage to someone considered undesirable. Like a widowed pig farmer with bad knees and 7 children named after saints no one liked. Dowries weren't just for first marriages either. Widows who remarried were expected to come with something. Usually smaller, often more negotiable, but still significant. Even nuns sometimes required a dowry to enter a convent. Because apparently, even giving up worldly pleasures required some upfront investment. There were, however, alternatives. Some regions allowed bride price, where the groom paid the bride's family instead, essentially buying the right to marry her. This was more common in earlier medieval periods or in certain cultures, and it carried its own awkward baggage. Imagine introducing your husband with, "This is Roger. He was on sale." And of course the church had opinions. Theologians debated whether dowries corrupted the sanctity of marriage. Were they symbols of mutual support, or thinly veiled bride transactions with extra steps? The church, as usual, said both, frowned deeply, and then charged a fee for the wedding. Sometimes, a dowry would be paid over time, or not at all. Many lawsuits from the period involved grooms suing their in-laws for failure to deliver the promised cow, or brides suing for the return of their dowry after being abandoned. Medieval marriage courts were, in short, reality TV with parchment and Latin. Yet, despite the math, many couples did find happiness. A small dowry didn't guarantee misery, and a large one didn't ensure bliss. People fell in love for stranger reasons. A shared joke, a kind gesture, a mutual dislike of the same bishop. And even in arranged marriages, affection often grew. Slowly, awkwardly, like a vine climbing a crumbling wall. So yes, love in the Middle Ages often came with a price tag. But even if it began with goats and ended in joint property disputes, it was still love. Just love with a receipt. If love is a battlefield, then the Middle Ages had 2 very different types of combatants. Noble hearts wielding poetry and heraldry like weapons, and pragmatic peasants armed with bread crusts and emotional endurance. Both sought companionship, Both got married. But how they loved. Entirely different games. Let's start with the nobles, those lofty figures in silk tunics and suspiciously clean shoes. For the medieval elite, love was something you talked about more than something you actually did. Noble romance was ritualized, coded, and usually tangled up in layers of politics, property rights, and parental ambitions. A noble marriage wasn't just two people tying the knot, it was two family empires negotiating an unholy merger, with the bride and groom often looking more like hostages than participants. Still, noblemen and noble women had their own romantic ideals, largely imported from courtly literature and almost always unrealistic. If you were a lady of high birth, your ideal man was brave, poetic, rich, probably French, and good at looking broody while standing near a window. He never smelled bad, and he always knew the right time to offer you a rose, a song, or a prayer. And if you were a nobleman, your fantasy lady was virtuous, delicate, radiant, possibly unattainable, and definitely already married. That was part of the thrill. Most courtly love stories were exercises in noble self-denial. Yes, I adore you, Lady Genevieve, but I must go fight in the Crusades now, to prove my worth. Also, your husband is watching us. So noble love became a kind of performance art. Men wrote sonnets to women they could never touch. Women replied with polite smiles and long silences. Everyone wore very tight clothing and said things like, "My heart doth ache, milady," which, in modern terms, translates to, "We flirted at the banquet and now I'm spiraling." But make no mistake, beneath the layers of protocol, nobles did fall in love. They whispered through tapestries. They met in gardens. They bribed servants to deliver letters. Occasionally, they risked scandal, and every now and then, they even married for love, though usually after their third or fourth political marriage had expired, inconveniently, via poison or jousting. Meanwhile, down in the mud and turnips, the peasants were living a very different kind of love story. Romance among the working class was less about longing sighs and more about practical decisions. Can you cook? Can you thatch a roof? Can we make it through winter without strangling each other over dried leaks? If yes, congratulations. You may proceed to the shared straw mattress. That's not to say peasants lacked passion. They just had less time for it. Love had to fit between harvesting, child rearing, mending tools, and swatting lice. You might fall for the blacksmith's daughter because she laughed at your jokes, or just because her father had a decent pig and you were out of options. Either way, the courtship was brief and mostly conducted in mud. Unlike their noble counterparts, peasants could sometimes marry more freely. Sure, there were still expectations, parents, church rules, and that one aunt who had opinions, but there was slightly more room for affection. A shared song, a secret dance at the midsummer feast, a loaf of bread baked just for you. These weren't grand gestures, but they meant something. There are even records of peasant couples fighting to be allowed to marry despite family objections. Some lovers ran away to neighboring villages. Others were fined for kissing in public, which honestly is kind of sweet. Nothing says true love like paying a chicken tax for unauthorized affection. Still, peasant marriages weren't all rosy. They were partnerships built on survival. Romance might fade, but if your spouse could patch your roof and knew how to cure a cough using boiled herbs and superstition, you held on to them. Love was a luxury. Cooperation was everything. It's easy to romanticize one over the other, noble passion versus peasant realism, but both had their charms. The nobles gave us the legends. The peasants gave us the humanity. One wrote poetry, the other raised 10 kids in a hut the size of a pantry, and occasionally the two worlds met, though it rarely ended well. A nobleman seducing a peasant girl was a common tale, usually ending with scandal, exile, or a poorly disguised paternity lawsuit. True cross-class love stories were rare, but when they happened, They were the stuff of whispered ballads and local legend, the shepherd boy and the lady, the knight and the baker's daughter. Forbidden, fleeting, and often fictional, but lovely just the same. So whether you were sighing in a tower or hauling buckets in the field, love in the Middle Ages found its way. It was flawed, tender, dramatic, and deeply human, which, honestly, sounds a lot like love today, minus the goats. Usually, somewhere in the flickering candlelit gloom of a medieval castle, or maybe behind a haystack in the village square, two people are glancing at each other a little too long. They shouldn't be. She's engaged, he's a monk. There's a scandal brewing, and it smells like roses, sweat, and poor decisions. Welcome to the delicious, dangerous world of forbidden love in the Middle Ages. Now, forbidden romances are nothing new. They've been making hearts race and gossip fly since Adam looked at Eve and said, "This seems like a trap, but okay." But in medieval Europe, breaking the rules of love wasn't just risky. It could get you excommunicated, exiled, imprisoned, shaved, or, in more exciting cases, beheaded. Let's start with the obvious: adultery. For nobles, marriage was rarely about love. It was about property, alliances, and making sure your children had enough land to squabble over later. So naturally, when two people got married without knowing each other, liking each other, or even speaking the same dialect, passions tended to wander. Affairs among nobles were common but also dangerous. A nobleman caught with another man's wife might face fines, duels, or the business end of a very sharp sword. A noblewoman caught with another man? Things got much worse. She could be disowned, imprisoned in a convent, or quietly disappeared into a damp tower, somewhere no one asked too many questions about, which of course made it all the more tempting. There are entire sagas of noble lovers who risked everything for each other. Some were poetic tragedies, like the ill-fated lovers Tristan and Isolde, whose story involved potions, betrayals, and a truly awkward deathbed situation. Others were just glorified gossip with a harp. Either way, their love defied rules, and that was part of the appeal. For peasants, things were less dramatic but no less intense. Romance outside of marriage could lead to fines, public humiliation, or the dreaded, quote, church penance, where you'd have to confess your sins in front of your entire congregation while looking very, very sorry. And by sins, we mean sins of the horizontal variety, yet people still took the risk. There are court records full of hilarious and heartbreaking accounts. Lovers caught sneaking into each other's cottages, secret meetings in the woods, and, in one memorable case, a pair of lovers who tried to disguise themselves as traveling musicians and failed because neither of them could sing. Then we have the clergy. Ah, yes, the men and women sworn to chastity who, in theory, were married to God. In practice, well, let's just say God had a lot of competition. Monks, priests, and nuns were supposed to be above earthly passion, but they were also human, very human. There are countless stories, some documented, others whispered, about secret liaisons in monasteries, pregnancies hushed up, and abbesses who turned a blind eye as long as nobody knocked over the candles. In one 13th century case, a nun wrote a love letter to a local scribe that was so passionate, scholars still debate whether it was an actual letter or a draft for medieval fan fiction. Either way, it's comforting to know even cloistered souls had a flair for the dramatic. And then there were the class-crossing affairs, noblemen and peasant women, high-born ladies and lowly squires. These were the stuff of legend and lawsuits. Sometimes they ended in forced marriages to preserve the lady's honor. Other times they ended in scandal, exile, and a very stern letter from the bishop. But every now and then they didn't end in disaster. Some couples managed to defy the odds. They ran away together. they found sympathetic clergy. They vanished into the mist, or more accurately, into another village with fewer nosy neighbors. It was rare, but it happened. Because even in a world where love was fenced in by laws, religion, and deeply suspicious relatives, the heart had a way of climbing over the wall. Usually with poor timing and no exit plan. Forbidden love in the Middle Ages was dangerous, complicated, and almost always messy. But it was also deeply human. The desire to choose, to connect, to risk something for someone, that's never gone out of style. And if nothing else, it gave the scribes plenty to write about. Ah, the medieval church. The great spiritual compass of the Middle Ages, guiding the masses toward salvation, moral virtue, and very specific instructions about what you could and absolutely could not do in bed. You might think of religion today as something personal, internal, a matter of faith. In medieval Europe, however, it was more like a full-time roommate who judged your every move, especially the horizontal ones. And if you thought love was complicated, you should have seen what happened when two consenting adults tried to express it without violating canon law, saintly opinion, or at least 3 major feast day restrictions. Let's begin with the basic message. Sex was not sinful, but only under very strict conditions. It had to be. Between a married man and woman in the missionary position on an approved day for the purpose of procreation without enjoyment. Sound fun? No? Perfect. You're on the right path to righteousness. The church's official view on sex was complicated. On the one hand, it acknowledged that marriage was necessary, and that, within marriage, sexual relations were allowed, even encouraged to an extent. On the other hand, it insisted that lust, even within marriage, was suspect. At best, sex was tolerated. At worst, it was a spiritual liability covered by a thin layer of holy paperwork. Church authorities produced exhaustive guides detailing what was acceptable in the bedroom. These weren't casual advice columns. They were intense theological manuals written by monks who, we can only assume, spent way too much time thinking about what other people were doing. Thomas Aquinas, for example, ranked sexual sins in detailed order, from minor indiscretions like too much affection, all the way to the real spiritual showstoppers. Oral acts, unapproved positions, and any behavior that even hinted at pleasure. If it felt fun, you were probably doing it wrong, or worse, right. There were even calendars showing when not to engage in marital intimacy, including Lent, 40 days, Advent, another 40 days, All Saints, Day Fridays because Jesus, Sundays because also Jesus, days before receiving communion, days before major saint feast, days after childbirth, and basically any time someone within 5 miles was fasting. All told, some scholars estimate that a medieval couple might have as few as 90 safe days per year, and that's assuming no one had a cold, wasn't traveling, and didn't get interrupted by the local priest delivering a surprise sermon. Even worse, confession. If you did anything outside the approved script, you were supposed to confess, in detail, to a priest, who, one assumes, had to keep a straight face while people nervously mumbled, "We may have tried something new." Some church guides even gave priests sample questions for confession. Did you think impure thoughts about your spouse? Did you enjoy it too much? Did you smile afterward? It's no wonder some medieval people developed spiritual performance anxiety. But here's the secret that rarely makes it into the official histories. People didn't always listen. Behind closed doors, medieval couples did what couples everywhere have always done: ignored half the rules, improvised, and hoped the ceiling didn't collapse mid-moment. There are court cases, confessional letters, and medical texts that suggest that, despite all the restrictions, people did experiment. They used herbal aphrodisiacs. They joked about bedroom habits. Some even read ancient Roman love poetry on the sly. For those not married, things were stricter, and yet no less complicated. Priests were often involved in enforcing celibacy laws, but sometimes too involved. Monasteries were not always the chaste bubbles we imagine. There are plenty of records of clergy, male and female, engaging in clandestine affairs, some of which resulted in mysterious children quietly adopted by relatives. As for LGBTQ+ relationships, the Church's stance was harsh and uncompromising. Same-sex relations were considered a grave sin, heavily punished if discovered. And yet, as always, love and desire found their way into hidden corners. Through poetry, coded letters, and quiet companionships no one dared speak aloud. So while the Church may have drawn the lines with ink, life, messy, passionate, unpredictable life, often colored outside of them, in a world where every kiss was watched and every touch could be questioned, the real miracle wasn't purity, it was persistence. People still fell in love, still made connections, still found warmth in a cold world, despite the paperwork, the sermons, and the faint smell of incense and repression. Because in the end, even in the Middle Ages, love laughed in Latin. You've navigated chaperones, exchanged handkerchiefs, survived the dowry negotiations, and gotten the bishop's reluctant blessing. Congratulations, it's finally time for the wedding. Except in the Middle Ages, a wedding wasn't just a celebration of love. It was an administrative headache, a public spectacle, and, depending on your social class, either a week-long party or a suspiciously fast handshake, followed by bread and awkwardness. Let's start with what a medieval wedding was not. It wasn't private, it wasn't solemn, and it definitely wasn't always voluntary. For nobles, a wedding was less about two people and more about two dynasties. If you were the bride, your thoughts and feelings on the matter were noted, considered, and promptly ignored. Your job was to wear something expensive, walk slowly, and try not to faint from the weight of your headdress. And yet, there was a formula to follow. The Church, always keen on structure, gradually formalized marriage as a sacrament. By the 12th century, canon law declared that consent was essential. But here's the twist. Verbal consent was enough. No priest needed. No paperwork. If a man and woman said, "I take you as my husband/wife," in front of witnesses, congratulations. You were married. Spiritually, legally, irreversibly. Naturally, this led to all sorts of problems. Secret marriages, forced declarations, panicked teenage vows whispered behind barns, later followed by, "Wait, what do you mean we're married now?" In fact, part of the Church's push for public weddings came because of these clandestine unions. So, to make things official and to keep local gossip under control, most people held their wedding at the church door. Literally. Not inside the church. No, that would be too cozy. Instead, vows were spoken outside, in public, where everyone could witness and, more importantly, report back if someone tried to deny it later. Once vows were exchanged, the priest might bless the union and lead the couple inside for Mass. Then came the feast. And oh, the feast! If you were rich, this was your chance to flaunt it. Tables groaned under the weight of roasted boar, candied fruits, pies shaped like castles, and maybe a juggler or two. There were toasts, music, gift-giving, and sometimes drunken poetry, which historians agree is always a mistake. Peasant weddings were simpler, but no less joyful. Bread, cheese, ale, maybe a stew, if someone had been particularly successful with turnips that week. Music played on whatever instruments hadn't been stolen by the neighbors, and dancing was lively, if a little muddy. Interestingly, medieval weddings weren't just about getting married. They were also about proving you were really married. That meant the dreaded bedding ceremony. Yes. After the feast, the couple was escorted to the bedchamber by family and friends, sometimes all the way to the bed itself, where prayers were said, blessings were offered, and doors were gently shut with more enthusiasm than privacy. In some noble circles, things got even more intrusive. Witnesses might stay outside the room and listen for confirmation. In rare cases, they even insisted on seeing the bed sheets. If this sounds horrifying, that's because it was. Why the obsession? Because inheritance mattered. Virginity was currency. And no one wanted a future heir's legitimacy questioned because someone forgot to send a clean sheet to the in-laws. Of course, not all weddings were willing affairs. Forced marriages were common, especially among noble women, who were often married off in their early teens to men twice their age, or worse, to boys their age, with just as much understanding of marriage as a confused goat. Even among peasants, pressure was real. If a couple had been caught being familiar, marriage might be required. If a dowry had already been paid, it was often considered a done deal, love optional, commitment mandatory. But sometimes, in between all the pageantry, property talk, and prayers, a little magic happened. Two people liked each other. They laughed at the same jokes. They danced a little closer. They whispered behind a curtain, and they said yes, not just out of duty, but out of hope. Because even in a world where love was taxed, timed, and witnessed by a dozen aunts with strong opinions, it still found a way to slip between the rules and say, let's try. So the next time you attend a wedding and complain about the playlist or the cake, just remember, at least no one's escorting you to bed while chanting the Psalms. So you've said your vows, danced the muddy wedding jig, survived the bedding ceremony, and spent a few months trying to figure out how to live with someone who eats turnips with their hands and snores like a dying bagpipe. What happens when medieval marriage doesn't work out? Well, in modern times, we have options: divorce, therapy, trial separations, late-night texts that say, "I just need space." But in the Middle Ages, breaking up wasn't just hard, it was almost impossible. Because if marriage was sacred, divorce was a direct challenge to heaven itself. And heaven, as we know, did not like paperwork. Let's start with the basics. Divorce, in the modern sense, did not exist in medieval Christian Europe. The Church considered marriage a sacrament, like baptism or communion. Once it was properly formed, public vows, consent, and that all-important physical consummation, it was spiritually indissoluble. In other words, once you tied the knot, the only thing that could untie it was death. Yours or theirs. Ideally theirs, if you asked politely and had a good alibi. That said, there were some technical options for escape. First, you had the annulment, a declaration that the marriage had never truly been valid in the first place. This wasn't, "we don't love each other anymore," but more like, "this union shouldn't have happened because of a legal or spiritual flaw." Common reasons included: one of you was underage, you were too closely related, hello, cousin marriages, there was a prior vow of celibacy or engagement, the marriage wasn't consummated. Annulments were rare, complicated, and expensive. They also required testimony, documentation, and a very patient bishop. Still, they did happen, especially among the noble classes who could afford to challenge the rules and bribe the right scribes. Perhaps the most famous medieval annulment was King Henry VIII's attempt to ditch Catherine of Aragon, claiming their marriage was invalid because she'd been married to his brother first. The Church wasn't impressed, so he solved the problem by inventing an entirely new church, beheading a few wives, and plunging England into religious turmoil. All because he didn't believe in, "it's not you, it's me." If you couldn't get an annulment, your next option was separation from bed and board. This was essentially legal separation. You stayed married in the eyes of the Church, but you lived apart, often granted in cases of abuse, abandonment, or grievous insult, which, let's face it, could cover anything from infidelity to poor table manners. But this too came with strings. Neither party was allowed to remarry. You could live separately, argue from a distance, and glare across market squares. But no new spouse, no new wedding, and certainly no romantic escapades unless you fancied eternal damnation or being stoned by peasants with surplus root vegetables. Among the peasantry, things were even murkier. Official divorces were rare. but informal separations did happen. A couple might quietly part ways, return to their families, or begin new relationships under the radar. These situations weren't legal, but they were tolerated, as long as no one made too much noise or started claiming someone else's goats. Meanwhile, women had it the worst. A wife couldn't initiate annulment without a compelling, church-approved reason, and "he's a lazy idiot" didn't count. Even in cases of abuse, getting away from a husband required evidence, witnesses, and usually a sympathetic priest, which, to put it gently, was not common. In some cities, local laws provided a few protections. In certain parts of Italy and the Low Countries, courts could rule on marital disputes, enforce financial separations, or offer mediation. But these were exceptions, not the rule. Still, medieval folks were creative. Some resorted to desertion, just disappearing one day and hoping no one followed. Others faked deaths, joined monasteries, or moved far enough away that they could start over without legal mess. Occasionally, a spouse would be declared civilly dead, allowing the other to remarry. It wasn't fast, it wasn't pretty, but it worked in a pinch. And in the quiet margins of society, love reinvented itself. Secret second families, unofficial unions, relationships that ignored the law and thrived anyway. Because the human heart, as we keep discovering, is very bad at obeying canon law. So if your medieval marriage went sour, your options were die, wait for them to die. Convince the Pope it never happened. Move to the next village and pretend your name is Gerard now. In all seriousness, while the institution of marriage in the Middle Ages was rigid, the people inside it were not. They laughed, cried, argued, and tried, sometimes with surprising tenderness. And when things fell apart, they found ways, both legal and quietly rebellious, to keep going. Because even if love couldn't be divorced, people still needed their own endings. If you thought modern dating came with a lot of unsolicited advice, passive-aggressive nudges, and suspiciously well-timed introductions, allow me to present the medieval equivalent, the matchmaker, and her equally formidable cousin, the meddling relative. Often an aunt, always armed with opinions, and occasionally with a goat. In the Middle Ages, love didn't blossom in isolation. It was rarely spontaneous, never entirely private, and frequently orchestrated by people who claimed to know what's best. Because whether you were a noble heir or a pig farmer's daughter, your romantic fate likely passed through someone else's hands first. Let's start with the professionals. Matchmakers were real and often respected figures in medieval communities, especially among the merchant and artisan classes. They went by many names: go-betweens, marriage brokers, intercessors, and in some places, fixers of fate. Their job was to evaluate two households, two potential spouses, and bring them together in a way that minimized scandal and maximized cows. Now, matchmakers weren't just looking at love compatibility. Oh no, they were running the medieval version of a background check. Are they fertile? Is there land involved? Any known heresies? How's the plague situation in their family tree? A successful matchmaker had to be part detective, part negotiator, and part therapist. And they had to be subtle. No one wanted to feel like they were being sold. But they were being sold, and everyone knew it. Among the Jewish communities of medieval Europe, matchmakers, known as shadachanim, were especially important. Marriage was both a religious and communal responsibility, and the shadchan served as a kind of respected facilitator. They even received a fee for their services, because apparently love isn't free, and neither is your aunt's travel fare. Speaking of aunts, if matchmakers were the formal route, relatives were the less subtle, more persistent alternative. And of these, the meddling aunt reigns supreme. No historical record confirms this officially, but if you look closely at marriage contracts, you can almost hear Aunt Marjorie whispering, "He's not handsome, but he owns a wheelbarrow." These relatives, mothers, aunts, older cousins, often knew all the village gossip, had extensive mental databases of eligible individuals, and a truly terrifying ability to spot potential from across a crowded feast. They might say things like, "You know, Lady Cecily's son is back from crusading and mostly intact. Young Thomas the Cooper has 3 pigs now. Very steady, very polite. Slight limp, but that's character. We should invite the baker's niece over for dinner. No reason, just saying." In noble households, matchmaking was even more serious. Families often hired agents or arranged matches through extended networks of lords, priests, and occasionally traveling troubadours, who doubled as messengers of awkward intentions. Sometimes, children were promised to each other long before puberty. Which sounds horrifying, because it was, but to the families, it meant security, alliance, and predictable holiday visits. Of course, the opinions of the bride and groom were taken into account occasionally, and usually just enough to say they were consulted, which, in medieval terms, meant someone shouted the names at them and waited for a polite nod. Still, not all arranged matches were cold-hearted. Many matchmakers, professional or familial, genuinely wanted their charges to be happy. They watched body language. They listened for shared laughter. They noted who refilled whose ale cup. If 2 people seemed to spark, they gently pushed them together at dances, feasts, and prayer sessions where hands could accidentally meet beneath the psalms. And when things did go well, the matchmaker basked in victory. The aunt claimed credit for decades. And everyone else said, "I knew it all along," while pretending they hadn't bet on it going horribly. But there were downsides too. A bad matchmaker could ruin reputations. An over-eager relative could pressure someone into misery, and if things fell apart after the wedding, you could be sure the matchmaker would not be invited to the second one. Still, in a world where romance was rarely spontaneous and always under supervision, these matchmakers, official or self-appointed, were the sparks behind many unions. They were the ones whispering possibilities, nudging elbows, arranging dance partners, and planting the idea that maybe, just maybe, the carpenter's daughter was more than just a skilled broom maker. Because sometimes, love needs a little help. Or at least a helpful aunt who won't take no for an answer. If you've been following along, you might assume the medieval monastery was the one place where hearts never fluttered and glances never lingered. A sacred fortress, free from the messiness of worldly attachment. Just quiet devotion, solemn prayer, and a strict bedtime. And you'd be adorably wrong. Because even behind stone walls, and under the watchful eyes of abbots and abbesses, the human heart had a habit of doing what it does best, causing problems. Now let's be clear. Monks and nuns took vows of chastity, obedience, and poverty. They renounced the world, committed to a life of prayer, and theoretically shut the door on romance the minute they put on the robe. But the cloistered life wasn't a magical spell that made desire disappear. If anything, removing people from worldly distractions just gave their emotions more time to wander, and sometimes wander straight into trouble. Let's start with the letters. Some of the most passionate romantic writing of the Middle Ages came not from wandering troubadours or sulking noblemen, but from a nun and her tutor, Heloise and Abelard. Abelard was a philosopher. Heloise was his brilliant student. They fell in love. Scandalously, she became pregnant. He was attacked by her angry relatives, a long story involving sharp objects. Both ended up in religious life. He became a monk, she a nun. But the feelings? Oh, they never went away. Their surviving letters are raw, tender, and very human. Heloise writes of her heartbreak and longing. Abelard tries to sound virtuous and fails spectacularly. The church had cloistered their bodies, but their minds remained stubbornly intertwined. If you want to ruin your belief in quiet medieval piety, just read one of Heloise's letters and prepare to blush on her behalf. And they weren't alone. Throughout monastic Europe, there were whispers of other forbidden connections, sometimes between monks and nuns, sometimes between fellow brothers, sometimes even between a nun and her confessor, because there's nothing like emotional vulnerability and spiritual intimacy to complicate things. How did they meet, you ask? Through letters, mostly. Or shared religious festivals, or, in rare cases, when monasteries and convents were built near each other, because what could go wrong placing two groups of celibate, emotionally repressed people across the road from each other? There are tales of monks who scaled cloister walls, of nuns who snuck out disguised as peasants, of lay brothers caught visiting the women's quarters with suspicious regularity. In some cases, these affairs led to scandal, excommunication, or being reassigned to remote postings that coincidentally had no roads, wine, or other humans. One 14th century monk was caught sneaking into a nunnery so often that the abbot reportedly asked if he was confused about which vow he'd taken. And then there's the issue of children. Yes, there were children born from these secret relationships. Some were hidden, adopted, or sent to live with sympathetic relatives. Others were acknowledged, quietly raised in the monastic community, or, less kindly, treated as a source of shame. But their existence proves what we already suspect, that not every vow held, and not every wall was high enough. Yet, not all monastic relationships were physical. Many were emotional, intense, intellectual bonds formed through shared writing, mentorship, or spiritual support. These could be just as powerful and just as controversial as physical affairs. Medieval theologians worried about these particular friendships, close emotional bonds that, they feared, could distract from divine devotion. Some convents even issued rules forbidding two nuns from spending too much time alone together, which sounds dramatic until you realize the rules didn't work. The heart, after all, remains the world's worst listener. Still, many monks and nuns lived sincerely devoted lives. They channeled their affection into mysticism, art, hymns, and elaborate illuminated manuscripts that may or may not contain suspiciously romantic symbolism. Some wrote poetry to God that reads, well, a little too passionate for polite worship. But can we really blame them? They were human, after all. Humans in isolation, with limited outlets, grappling with the same desires, fears, and longing that fill every heart, regardless of robe color or sleeping arrangements. So yes, romance happened in monasteries. Sometimes forbidden, sometimes tragic, sometimes just two souls reaching for connection in a world that told them not to. And in that quiet defiance, there's a kind of love story, all its own. Long before dating apps, awkward icebreakers, or Instagram thirst traps, people still faced the same timeless question: how do I make someone fall in love with me? And in the Middle Ages, the answer, more often than not, involved roots, herbs, muttered incantations, and a deep belief in the romantic potential of beetles. Welcome to the strange and surprisingly crowded corner of medieval life dedicated to love magic, a blend of folklore, superstition, early science, and pure desperation. Because when courtship rituals involve chaperones, dowries, and ecclesiastical supervision, some people turn to more creative methods. Let's start with the classic, the love potion. Contrary to what fantasy novels would have you believe, medieval love potions weren't bubbling purple elixirs served in skull goblets. They were often unpleasant concoctions made from herbs, animal parts, and whatever the village wise woman had lying around. Common ingredients included mandrake root, allegedly shaped like a person and believed to scream when pulled from the ground; henbane, mildly toxic and excellent for hallucinations; rosemary, for remembrance and fidelity; and beetles, because of course. One particularly horrifying recipe involved dried bat hearts, powdered to a fine dust and added to wine. The idea: you'd slip the drink to your intended, and voila, instant affection, or stomach cramps. It was a 50-50 gamble. There were also more subtle tricks. A piece of bread baked with a drop of your blood. A token hidden in your beloved shoe. Whispering their name into a mirror 3 times while standing in moonlight, then eating a clove of garlic and praying to St. Agnes. That last one is oddly specific, and we have questions. And yes, people really believed in these things. In rural communities, cunning folk, herbalists, midwives, amateur alchemists often served as unofficial matchmakers. They'd craft charms, sell potions, or offer advice on how to win the affections of a reluctant sweetheart. Some even claimed to reverse heartbreak, untangle jealousy, or bring back wandering husbands. For a price, of course, usually paid in chickens or bread. But it wasn't just peasants dabbling in romantic magic. Nobles were known to employ astrologers and mystics to determine the best dates for marriages, or to create talismans believed to enhance passion and fertility. Kings consulted seers. Queens wore amulets. Everyone was just one potion away from bliss, or a very strange rash. Then there were love charms, physical objects imbued with romantic power. These might be a carved wooden token, a ribbon tied with specific knots, a brooch with engraved initials and secret symbols, or, more disturbingly, small animal bones worn in a pouch under the clothes. And let's not forget the medieval obsession with astrology. It was widely believed that the alignment of the stars influenced emotions. If Venus and Mars were in the right positions, romance would bloom. If Mercury was in retrograde, well, even medievals knew to blame Mercury. Nothing said doomed love quite like a badly timed eclipse. Of course, the church was deeply suspicious of all this. Love magic flirted dangerously close to heresy, witchcraft, and unnatural manipulation of God's will. If a potion was discovered, the consequences could be severe, especially if it was used on someone married, noble, or connected to the clergy. In one 14th century case, a woman was publicly shamed and exiled for trying to lure a monk into romance using a potion made of wine, herbs, and whispered Latin, which, to be honest, sounds like a medieval cocktail. But for all the danger, the demand never stopped. Because whether it was a spell scribbled on parchment, a charm sewn into a dress hem, or a mysterious tea handed over by a wide-eyed apprentice, these medieval dating hacks represented something universal: hope. The hope that you could be noticed, chosen, loved, and sometimes they even worked. Not because of magic necessarily, but because belief is a powerful thing. If you think a charm will make you braver, more confident, more irresistible, you might just act like someone worth loving. Plus, nothing breaks the ice quite like, "So I baked you this biscuit with herbs and minor enchantments." Beauty, as they say, is in the eye of the beholder. But in 1347, the beholder had some very particular tastes. And if you're imagining slender necks, full lips, or symmetrical faces, well, yes. But also, no eyebrows, wide hips for birthing, and a firm grasp of embroidery techniques. Let's take a gentle stroll through the aesthetics of medieval attraction. And spoiler alert, it was less about smoldering glances and more about the size of your forehead. First and foremost, physical beauty was heavily linked to morality. If you were considered attractive, people believed it was a reflection of your inner virtue, your piety, modesty, and overall spiritual cleanliness, which is a lot of pressure to put on a jawline. For women, the medieval ideal looked something like this: very pale skin, because tanning meant you worked outdoors, i.e., you were poor. Blonde hair, the lighter the better, even if it meant bleaching it with lye and sunbathing your scalp. High forehead, so some women plucked their hairlines to raise their brow. Yes, voluntary hair removal centuries before it became trendy. Small, rosebud lips, ideally always closed. A quiet woman was a beautiful woman, slender frame, but with wide hips. Not too voluptuous. This wasn't the Renaissance yet, but definitely capable of bearing healthy sons. Delicate hands, unused to manual labor, and preferably scented with herbs, not pigs. In short, if you looked like you spent your days praying, sighing, and gently dying of poetic longing, you were a catch. Men, on the other hand, were judged more by character, status, and the contents of their pouch. Coin pouch, obviously. But physical traits mattered too. Tall and broad-shouldered was in fashion. Strength implied protection, and no one wanted to marry someone who couldn't carry a bale of hay or swing a sword. Curly hair was admired, often compared to the hair of angels. And if you were bald, just wear a hat and be very good at poetry. Beards came in and out of style depending on the decade, the region, and which king was setting the trends. But generally, a neatly trimmed beard meant wisdom and maturity, while a wild beard meant either a philosopher or someone who had forgotten where the comb was. Tanned skin was more acceptable in men. It meant you worked, hunted, rode. Just don't look too rugged, or you might be mistaken for a bandit. Now, let's talk non-physical appeal, because this mattered a lot. For women, chastity and modesty were paramount. You could be plain, but if you were pious, obedient, and could spin wool like a legend, someone would want to marry you. Household skills were sexy. Could you cook without poisoning? Could you weave a decent tapestry? Could you manage servants without causing a rebellion? Dreamy. For men, wealth was always attractive. A man with land, a trade, or a full set of teeth, bonus, was considered prime marriage material. Piety was important too, especially for women looking for stable husbands unlikely to be accused of heresy or gambling away the oxen. And of course, reputation mattered. If your name was associated with honor, good humor, or the ability to quote St. Augustine at a feast, you had admirers. But here's the charming part. Despite all the ideals, people often fell for the wrong type. Court records, love letters, and ballads are full of mismatched lovers. A plain baker's daughter who stole the heart of a minor knight. A drunken tanner who won his bride with a funny dance. A noblewoman who chose a penniless scribe because he could write her name in 5 languages. Because while ideals were nice in theory, real affection didn't care about fashion or foreheads. And just like today, the most attractive thing you could be in 1347 was kind, or at least hygienic. And so we come to the end of our winding, muddy, candlelit tour through the strange and endearing world of medieval romance. We've learned that love in the Middle Ages was both incredibly structured and wildly chaotic, that it came with contracts, cows, and confessions, that people longed, lied, sang, scribbled, prayed, and occasionally jumped out of convent windows, all in the name of love. We've seen noble couples writing poetry they'd never read aloud, peasants stealing kisses between chores, matchmakers whispering at feasts, and church officials frowning deeply at the concept of joy. Despite all the rules, restrictions, and truly unfortunate fashion choices, medieval love was vibrant, messy, funny, painfully human. It wasn't always about romance. It was about partnership, survival, companionship, and occasionally passion in the hayloft. And even when it failed, when dowries fell through, when hearts broke, when potions backfired, it left behind stories. Glorious, ridiculous, heartwarming stories. So the next time you hear someone sigh that love used to be simpler, just smile and remind them that in the 14th century, someone literally plucked off their eyebrows for romance. And if that's not love, we don't know what is.